I'm Dave Ackley. I'm the warm-up act. I have been instructed to make sure everybody is aware of this, which is on the screen now. This is a new thing that SFI is doing this year in combination with the Center for Contemporary Arts, where they take movies selected by SFI scientists, and each movie has an introduction by the scientist. Then everybody gets to watch the picture in this new context brought by the perspective of the people that selected the movie, and then afterwards there's discussion and question and answer. So it's a new thing. The first movie is on March 8th. It's War Games, selected by Simon DeDeo, and you should pick up one of these and take a look at them. They look like they could be quite a bit of fun. Okay? That's the official ad. Alrighty. I am thrilled to be introducing Brian Christian tonight because he's great and because I get to talk about me first. I'm in the computer science department in Albuquerque at UNM. I will do me. Okay, here we go. I just got to do the hip-hop thing. So I'm down in Albuquerque. I realized the other year that actually I've been in New Mexico longer than I've been anywhere. Land of enchantment, I guess. And the computers keep on getting smaller, and the students keep on getting younger. And I keep on thinking about artificial life, which is one of my main research areas. The idea that living systems and machines or computer systems are somehow related. And I've been thinking about this for so many decades that I am now convinced that people and machines are essentially the same thing. Now, I have observed some people don't like to be called machine. But I think that's really just because we have these terrible, pitiful, sad machines that we use as examples. They're rigid, they're oblivious, they're blind, they're gullible. Our computers today, where people are incredibly context dependent. They're embodied, they're aware, they're flexible and adaptive to the circumstances they find themselves in. And I do the research that I do because I want to make machines more like that. Because I think we need our machines to be more like that. So now the thing about Brian, well, he's got a degree in computer science, which is fine, but he's also got a degree in philosophy and an MFA in poetry, which I find extremely aggravating. And with all of this, he did this incredibly great thing. He took the same stuff that I think about, people, machines, and imagined it completely the other way around. Not looking at people to see what's wrong with machines, but using machines as a lens into human behavior. I mean, sometimes people are rigid and oblivious. And I hate that in other people. But Brian has found a tremendous amount of interesting stuff in this interplay. How machines work, how people work, and what we can learn about from each of them. And I'm expecting he'll be drawing on that stuff in his talk tonight. It really is a mixture of computer science and philosophy and even poetry. I think you'll enjoy it. And besides, in the spirit of human embeddedness and context dependence, the way Brian and I met is he's my college friend's daughter's college friend. So you have to like him. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Brian Christian.
Thanks so much, Dave, for the introduction. It was my good fortune that the process of researching the book put me into contact with Dave, and we've become friends ever since. And so it's really meaningful to be here, and thanks for that. And thanks for to the Santa Fe Institute for bringing me back to Santa Fe. It's a real honor. It's a real pleasure. There seems to be no flat surface for the water, so I'm going to set the water on the ground. You'll have to forgive extra long water breaks if that comes up. So the title of the talk is The Most Human Human: What Artificial Intelligence Teaches Us About Being Alive. And I think the subtitle is fairly straightforward. The title comes from one of the seminal concepts in the field of artificial intelligence, and it's something called the Turing test. The Turing test goes back to the British codebreaker and mathematician Alan Turing, who in 1950, as the computer as we know it was only just in its infancy, was already asking these really theoretical and philosophical questions. For example, can machines think? And so Turing's answer to this question was to immediately sort of bypass philosophizing and theorizing and say, we're going to put that to the side and propose a practical test. And the test that he devised, he called the imitation game. We now know it as the Turing test. The basic idea behind the imitation game is that you have three parties. You have judges, confederates, and bots, and I'll explain how that works. The basic idea is that you convene a panel of scientists, and they're the judges. And they sit in these rooms, and they're logged on to computers, having these instant message conversations, sending text back and forth with entities that they can't see. Now, half of these entities are human beings that are hidden in a room down the hall, and these are called confederates. The other half are computer programs claiming to be human beings hidden in a room down the hall, and they're called the bots. And the basic idea is that these bots attempt to do their best to persuade the judges that they are the humans and not the actual humans. Turing very famously predicted that by the year 2000, bots would regularly be fooling the judges about 30% of the time. And that as a result, he says, one will be able to speak of machines thinking. Now, this was back in the 50s, and the technology was nowhere near the point at which a practical test could be held. This was purely a thought experiment. Until the early 1990s, when a man by the name of Hugh Loebner, who is a rogue disco dance floor salesman from New Jersey, he specializes in plastic roll-up lighted portable disco dance floors, and has made such sums selling these that he's decided to become a benefactor of science. And so in 1991, he decided, I think that computing technology has reached a point where we're ready for a practical test. Let's actually hold a Turing test every year. And he agreed to put up the money. And being a modest fellow, he called it the Loebner Prize. It's been running every year from 1991 to the present. And Alan Turing, as we remember, had this famous threshold that we'd reached this point, he said, by the year 2000, where 30% of the judges would be fooled. And this is one of the famous predictions of computer science, unlike things like Moore's Law. Turing's prediction is one of the famous ones that did not come true. However, in the 2008 Loebner Prize competition, one bot in particular managed to fool 3 out of the 12 judges into thinking that it was human, or 25%. So in other words, it came up just one vote shy of Turing's famous threshold. And this was the point at which my attention really got piqued. And I felt that it was time for me to personally take a stand on behalf of humanity. That we had come, within a whisker of a Turing test defeat in 2008, and so there was this voice inside me that rose up and just said, "Not on my watch." And so I contacted the organizers in 2009, and I signed up to be one of the 4 actual human Confederates. And so I found myself in an extremely strange position, which is preparing for a contest in which I have to persuade another person that I'm human. And as I learned, the contest is set up in this very strange way. Each judge, of course, doesn't know whether they're talking to a person or a computer. And so after each conversation that the judge has, they have to make a sort of guess how confident they are that they were talking to a person. And so what you end up with at the end of each contest is a ranking where everyone has these scores that they've accumulated after talking to all the judges. And the computer every year that gets the highest score wins this bronze medallion that Hugh Loebner is holding here, and a small research grant, and the title of the most human computer of the year. You may see where this is also going, which is that there's also a real person that gets the highest score every year. The real person who is most successfully able to persuade the judges that they are, in fact, human, they win the Most Human Award. And so for me, the Most Human Award is the entry point into the larger question that I want to talk about tonight, which is this idea, put very simply, of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean? For me, I had to ask myself this question at a very practical level. What does it mean to go to this competition and act human? But then I found increasingly I was haunted by that question in my everyday life. What does it mean to act human when I'm talking to my friends at a restaurant? What does it mean to act human when I send a colleague an email? And what I found as I researched the history of computation in the 20th century, but also specifically the history of the Turing test, is that, in fact, artificial intelligence is casting a very strange and interesting light on what are some of these timeless questions of philosophy. It's really sort of upending some of these major ancient questions in what is, for me, a completely fascinating way. And so tonight I'd like to tell 3 stories that are going to look at 3 of the different ways in which the development of the computer is reshaping our intuitions about who we are. The first story is going to center on the difference between what I'm calling sensitivity and reason. And I'll come back to this in a second. But we begin with a love story, which I think is a fitting place to begin any meditation on what it means to be human. Specifically, we begin with the love story of a man named Claude Shannon. Claude Shannon was born in 1916. He is one of the real fathers of computation and information theory as we know it. One of the big progenitors of computer chess, of cryptography, and specifically, I want to talk about the way that Claude Shannon met his wife. He met his wife, Betty, at work. This was Bell Labs in the World War II time frame in Murray Hill, New Jersey. He was there as an engineer, working on cryptography and signal transmission. And Betty was a computer. I'll use this as a water break. Now, if anything about that sounds odd to you, I should mention that nothing seemed out of the ordinary to them whatsoever, nor to their colleagues. In fact, their romance was not only not bizarre, but in fact it was rather typical. Engineers and computers wooed all the time. I can skip that. Now, perhaps I can clear this up with the following picture of several computers. What I'd like to point out is that the computers in this picture are the women. They're not the machines. And specifically, the word computer from the 17th century up into the mid-20th century did not refer to a mechanism at all. It was a job description. A computer was someone who performed calculations for a living. And the use of these human computers was instrumental in everything from the first accurate predictions of the return of Halley's Comet to the Manhattan Project here in New Mexico, where Nobel laureate Richard Feynman oversaw a team of computers at Los Alamos. And so when these mechanical devices first started coming into scientific and public consciousness in the 40s and 50s, no one really knew what they were, and so the founders of computer science had to explain them by metaphor. And so if you look back at some of the early seminal papers of computer science, you see these very strange statements, like, for example, as Alan Turing himself puts it, the idea behind digital computers may be explained by saying that these machines are intended to carry out any operations which could be done by a human computer. So what he's saying is, you can think of this device as, well, it's kind of like a computer in a way. But as we know, in the 60 years since Turing made that statement, the quotation marks have shifted. In 1940, it was the mechanical or digital contraption that was like a computer. In 2012, it's the human math whiz that is like a computer. The literal and the figurative have switched places. And I think that in many ways, this is a huge shockwave through, in some ways, the entire history of Western philosophy. And so I'll take us, we'll go straight from the 1950s back to Aristotle. Aristotle is considering the question that has sort of haunted philosophy all the way up until the present, which is, what does it really mean to be a person? What is it that makes us distinctive, special, unique? What does it mean to live well? And he answered that question, as many philosophers have done, which is to look at the world around himself and say, well, how am I different from everything else? And so specifically, he wanted to know, well, how are people different from plants and animals? And so he comes up with this theory that there are three different kinds of souls. He says plants have what's called the nutritive soul. They can sustain themselves in a changing environment. They can preserve their state. They can reproduce different copies of themselves. Animals, in addition to having a nutritive soul, also have what he calls the sensitive soul. And this includes everything from the senses, perceiving, tasting, smelling, touching, motor control, moving through an environment, having an awareness of your body, being able to manipulate objects or move through space, desires, hunger, lust, fatigue, all of these that we associate with being an animal are part of what he calls a sensitive soul. Humans uniquely, he claims, have a third soul that he calls the rational soul. And the idea of the rational soul is it's everything that animals can't do. It's our ability to comprehend abstract concepts, to think about things divorced from our physical embodied world. So to think about things like numbers, algebra, arithmetic, deduction, geometry, and so forth. In short, everything that computers can do better than we can now. And so for me, there's this real crisis in the idea that no longer are we not the only things in the universe that can, for example, do long division. We are by no means the best. And I think that really throws us back on this question of thinking about what it is that makes us special and what our unique skills really are. The Aristotelian sort of rationality first view, he goes so far as to say that, excellence and perfection in a human life is to spend it in the act of contemplation. And he goes so far as to say that the activity of the gods must be a form of abstract contemplation, which is a very convenient conclusion for a professional philosopher to reach. We get something similar when we come almost 2,000 years later to Descartes. In his famous Meditations, Descartes practices this idea of radical doubt. So he says, I've convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? He says, no. And what follows is the most famous sentence of all of philosophy, which is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And it's in some ways the same idea that Aristotle had, repackaged slightly and set into a more Christian context, where he's saying, I don't even know that I have a body. It's not merely that the functions of my body aren't particularly a big deal or important because animals share them, but I don't even know if they're real. All that I know is that I have this capacity for abstract, rational intellect. And it sort of goes in this interesting way along with Christian theology, this idea that we tend to associate things like appetite for food, appetite for sex, dancing, these sorts of physical things as being kind of the purview of the bad guy, and fasting and chastity and sort of rational contemplation are part of the good guy team. And again, I think this is a framework that doesn't really sustain itself when you think about the history of the computer. That part of what we're finding is that, in fact, it's the sensitive soul, to use Aristotle's framework, where a lot of the most interesting and computationally complicated things are happening. And I'll give you an example. So there's an idea in AI called Moravec's paradox, and it goes something like this. So I'll give you guys a simple quiz here. So I'm going to give you two problems, and I want you to think about which one you would consider easier. Okay, so the following is a chess position. If there are any hardcore chess fans out there, you'll recognize it as Kasparov-Topalov 1999, the greatest chess move of all time. So your job is to find it. Which move is it? Okay, so that's option A. Option B is to tell me what this is a picture of. Okay, so by a show of hands, who would rather tackle the first one? Okay, that's pretty much what I expected. Moravec's paradox goes basically as follows. Everything that we thought was hard turned out to be easy, and everything that we thought was easy turned out to be hard. That in fact, we have computers that can solve the first problem, but we're still working on basic image recognition. We're still working on voice recognition even. It's still pretty rough around the edges, even when you throw supercomputers at it. That for me, this is part of this larger story. We have computers regularly flying planes. We're working on cars, and we haven't figured out bicycles yet. That it's almost, you get this sense of evolution running in reverse. that computers have proven themselves adept at the things that take human expertise, but they're terrible at the things that a 4-year-old could do. Well, that doesn't really accord with the Aristotelian idea of where the true complexity of being a person lies. And to sort of wrap up this thread, I want to look at one of the famous recent AI showdowns. So about almost exactly a year ago, the IBM supercomputer Watson competed on television at Jeopardy against the two Homo sapien champions, Ken Jennings, who's on your left, and Brad Rutter, who's on your right. And both Ken and Brad are still looking pretty chipper in this photograph, which was taken at the beginning of the match. But the final score was Rutter 21,000, Jennings 24,000, Watson 77,000. It becomes hard to sort of stomach these milestones in the history of AI as defeat after defeat. First checkers, then chess, now Jeopardy. But I think there is a sort of redemptive narrative to it, if you want to take a different lens on it. And it's this idea of Moravec's paradox that we have computers that still correct the spelling of professional wordsmiths, but we don't have computers that can plausibly read a sentence out loud and have it sound natural, which most children can do. We have computers translating scientific and political documents, but we don't have them reliably able to look at a dog and say, oh, that's a dog. That, in fact, it's not these things that require expertise, but it's the fundamental, experiential, embodied, raw stuff of daily life is where the hidden and unsung computational complexity of life resides. You walk down the street on two legs. You're probably not very impressed with me as a speaker that I'm standing upright when I'm talking to you. But the Segway has 3 computers in it dedicated solely to keeping it standing upright. You're walking down the street, you sidestep a puddle, you recognize your friend, you exchange a few words. There's more going on here than is going on at the chessboard, even when Kasparov and Topalov play. And so, for me, I look at the Watson contest and I say, it may be going too far to call it a victory for the humans, but it's at the very least the kind of validation that the challenge for the IBM team was not how to store and retrieve almost all historical knowledge, which is what impresses us about Brad and Ken, but it was precisely the things that we take for granted about Brad and Ken, that they can understand natural language, that they can understand what a question is getting at. And that, for me, I think is sort of a profound message, that the complexity wasn't in the things that make the two of them Jeopardy champions. It was in the things that make them people. The second story that I want to tell is about the difference between the concept of the aggregate, the group, the collective, and the individual. And that story begins with one of my arch rivals in the 2009 Turing test, which is a chatbot program called Cleverbot. Cleverbot is the work of a British programmer named Rollo Carpenter. It is a multiple winner of the Most Human Computer Award. The basic way that Cleverbot works is that it sits around online and it just talks to people. In fact, it's had over 65 million conversations to date. I think the longest one was about 19 hours with one bathroom break on the human side. And it records absolutely everything you say. So if you say hello, it records that and tags it in a database that humans open conversations with the word hello. If it says hello to you and you say, hey, what's up? it tags that in the database as, if you say hi to someone, they may say, hello, what's up? And basically, it just meticulously organizes all this information and then coughs it back up later. It doesn't necessarily sound particularly impressive, but over the course of 65 million conversations and 15 years, you get some pretty Turing test plausible scenarios. So for example, I went online and I wanted to size up the competition. So I started talking to Cleverbot. Knowing all the while, I mean, it's like getting Mirandized, that all of my words are literally going to be used against me. So I said, well, okay, Cleverbot, what's your favorite color? Mine's purple. What's yours? Okay. What's 2 plus 2? 4. All right. What's the capital of France? Paris. I asked a slightly more complicated one. What is the capital of Romania? It says, Budapest? I don't know. And this is for me where it starts to get slightly eerie, because computer systems are not known for graceful degradation, right? So the correct answer is Bucharest. So the idea that it would get something, phonetically close to that is quite a human thing. I tried telling it jokes, so I recycled some jokes that were sort of floating around on the internet at the time. So I said, do you know why they call it an Xbox 360? Cleverbot buys the joke. Why? I said, because when you see it, you turn 360 degrees and walk away. And Cleverbot, in fact, corrects my joke. No, because then you would be facing it, and that would be unfunny. So my next plan was to try speaking in French, which I don't even speak. So I said, je habite dans les États-Unis, and I find that Cleverbot not only understands what I'm saying, but it corrects me. On dit j'habite aux États-Unis. At this point, I'm getting a little desperate. So I just throw some random pop culture references at it. Twilight. Yes, Twilight. The book Twilight. I hate it. I also hate Twilight, the movie. So at this point, I try singing to Cleverbot. If there are any Queen fans, you'll recognize Scaramouche, Scaramouche from Bohemian Rhapsody. Cleverbot replies, will you do the Fandango? Thunderbolt and lightning? Very, very frightening. Galileo? Galileo, Galileo. Now all of this is starting to make me a little bit concerned. But my concern vanishes when I start asking Cleverbot about its love life. I say, Cleverbot, do you have a boyfriend? Not at the moment, but I hope to find one soon. So I boldly ventured, I would like to be your boyfriend. Cleverbot replies, that would be difficult since I'm happily married. Do you have a boyfriend? No, I'm still looking for love. Do you have a husband? I don't have a husband because it would be illegal for me to have one since I'm male. At this point, I feel like I'm getting a mixed signal. I say, what gender are you? Female. I say, wait, do you have a boyfriend? Not at the moment, but I live in hope. Can I be your boyfriend? No, I'm straight. And I think you're starting to get a sense for what Cleverbot's strengths and weaknesses are. That because it is literally built out of pieces of human interaction, at the granularity of a single response, it sounds pretty good. In fact, in many cases, uncanny. But for the same reason, because it's sort of kaleidoscoped out of tens of thousands of different people, you get the sense that you're not actually talking to a person. You're talking to this very strange pastiche or collage of all these different voices. And in fact, despite the very clear label on the Cleverbot site that says users are never talking with a person, no matter how plausible it seems, there's in fact this conspiracy theory that you can read about online, where people say, can it be that I'm actually talking to a real person, but that we are both tricked to believe that the other one is Cleverbot? And the conspiracy theory centers around this concept that's called nexting. If you're under 18, you probably know what nexting is. If you're not, it comes from a series of websites. One is called Omegle, another one is called Chat Roulette. The idea behind these websites is to bring some of the random serendipity back into the internet. Now that we live in this age where you're always sort of using your real name and so forth, you log onto these sites and you are paired completely at random with a stranger from anywhere in the world, and you just have to start talking to them. I don't recommend doing Chat Roulette because it also has video, and looking at the things that people do when they have that kind of anonymity is not for the faint of heart. But Omegle is purely text. You just are thrown into a chat room with a complete stranger, and you're asked to start from a blank slate. And so I started experimenting with it because I thought it was somehow it felt like good Turing test training for me. The catch in Omegle is that there's this button that says next. And when you hit that button, the screen wipes, and now you're talking to a different person. So there's this weird anxiety when you're in one of these chat rooms that you're going to get nexted. So you hear these, teenagers or whatever complaining, and oh man, we were really hitting it off. Then I got nexted. But you can imagine what might happen if, for example, the site was automatically nexting you to different people, but not giving you any visual indication that this was happening. So all of a sudden, your question about the Yankees, that you were talking to a Yankees fan, and you say, who's your favorite Yankees player? Well, now you've been nexted without realizing it. You're talking to a Sox fan, and they get really upset. You can imagine the kind of confusion that comes out of this, the kind of strange, ground-up types of conversations, start to rather closely approximate what Cleverbot looks like. Rollo Carpenter calls Cleverbot a conversational Wikipedia. And I think it's very significant. I think it's extremely important to think about this idea that there really is almost no difference between talking to Cleverbot and talking to real people if you're being automatically nexted from person to person. That the Turing test becomes extraordinarily hard to pass under these conditions. One of the reasons is this idea that comes from statistics called statefulness. So there's this idea of this thing called the Markov property, which is that the past doesn't matter. You put in an input and you get the output. That's all you need to know. You give someone a cue and you get the A. And that's all there is to the interaction. Well, we know that conversation really isn't like this. That in fact, the entire history of the conversation is a part of the interaction. And the 20th time your nephew asks you, are we there yet, is going to get a different answer than the first time he asks you. And that's part of this idea that conversation is stateful, that you build up a conversational history, and it informs the things that are going to come later. Online, with Cleverbot and Omegle, you get something that I call the mulch effect. And it's this idea that the line between natural intelligence and artificial intelligence is blurring at precisely this place, precisely this area of the impersonal collective. So there are a number of pop culture critics that warn against the move towards this society where everything is sort of open source and wiki and anonymized and so forth. And one of them is Jaron Lanier. And he has this quote. He says, "The Sims, the iPhone, the Pixar movies, all of our beloved expressions of digital culture are ultimately personal expressions. True, there's this team of collaborators, but there's always a central figure guiding the vision and directing the team. And he echoes the words of Nietzsche, who in the 19th century said of human life, in the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. And he goes on to say, which I really sort of enjoy, whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste. And Jaron Lanier uses these sorts of arguments to defend MySpace, for example. He says, sure, it looks completely ugly, but that's what happens when you give people the freedom to design it however they like. On Facebook, everything looks really pretty because they constrain you, and that, they're basically destroying your ability to sort of represent your personality. So this idea that maintaining the sense of a coherent single identity and taste, this turns out to be completely huge in the Turing test, because that's one of the main weapons that someone like me has at persuading the judge that I'm not, for instance, Cleverbot. Because I have to doggedly stay myself and continue to sound like myself in each of these exchanges. Here's what happens when things go slightly awry. So this is a conversation that I observed with one of my fellow Confederates in 2009. The judge says, "Hi there," and he cheerfully replies, "Good day, mate." The judge asks him, "Have you come far to be here?" And he says, "Oh, not really, from the Southwest." And fortunately for this particular Confederate, he was able to win the judge back in the end. But you can see how this is the kind of thing that starts to raise warning flags. That once you start seeming like you're not fully consistent, that becomes a place where the computers can start to get an advantage. For me, the idea that the line between, if we're using the Turing test as our benchmark for what humanity is, the idea that this line blurs when you start shifting the identity of the person, for me, starts to affect the way that I think about art, too, and think about culture. So, for example, as a kid, I loved the Hardy Boys books, and I read them all the way through, and somewhere around the 20th book, I started to lose interest. And I didn't know whether that was because I was growing up, or I'd simply read too many, or, they had just lost the magic. But it felt like something intangible was missing. In fact, something very tangible was missing, which was the author. That the Hardy Boys books were written pseudonymously as Franklin W. Dixon, but the real man who wrote the books is named Leslie McFarlane. And he wrote all of, I believe, the first 16 books. And the next 16 books, again, all pseudonymously attributed to Franklin W. Dixon, but the next 16 books were written by a rotating cast of 10 different writers. And for me, when I think about this idea of nexting, I think that's completely outrageous. That what's the difference between fiction and fan fiction, right? I don't care what some writer thinks Chet would have said when they found out that the killer was the amusement park ride operator. I don't care what some writer thinks Chet would have said. I care what Leslie McFarlane thinks Chet would have said. And I think that's part of why we turn to art, is for this stability of identity. And the same problem comes up in machine translation, that algorithms like Google are basically doing to translation what Cleverbot does to conversation. They're taking this massive archive of human translations, running it through a kind of statistical wood chipper, and then using those tiny little fragments to piece together new translations. It turns out that if you're looking at scientific writing or business plans and these sorts of things, it doesn't really matter that you're effectively outsourcing every few words of the document to a different translator. But as long as they're all competent, you get the message. It doesn't really work if you're looking at literature. And so one of the things that has sort of plagued machine translation efforts. I should say that most of the statistical fodder that Google Translate uses are United Nations minutes, because they are simultaneously translated into so many different languages by so many extremely competent people. So the ground up bits of UN minutes are basically underpinning a lot of machine translation currently. But this technique doesn't work in a novel. That part of what you want when you read a novel is the same exact voice, the same quirks that are happening page after page. And when you outsource the translation to a different translator every sentence, you completely lose that. Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass has this famous passage where he says, "I'm the hounded slave. I wince at the bite of the dogs. I'm the mashed fireman with the breastbone broken. I'm the old artillerist. I swallow it all. It becomes mine. I see and hear everything." And I think that in the 19th century, this is sort of a laudable attempt at a kind of radical empathy, identifying so strongly with your fellow humans that you really feel like you are everybody. You have everybody's perspective all at once. In the 21st century, this isn't really a heroic idea anymore. In the 21st century, the person who sees everything, is every person, is not the hero of the story. They're the villain. The Borg in Star Trek, or the Agent Smiths of the Matrix, that it's the villains that now are this collective consciousness. And it's the singular heroic individual that we turn to as kind of the beacon of humanity. And so for me, I think that's a counterintuitive idea that comes out of the Turing test, that one of the essential qualities of being a human is being a human. The third and the last story that I want to tell you has to do with the difference between what we are and how we are. It starts with a man named Steve Royster. Growing up, Steve Royster assumed that he had an extremely strange voice. And the reason is, he says, everyone always knew when I was calling them just by the sound of my voice, whereas I had no earthly idea who was on the phone when they called me. It took until his late 20s for Steve Royster to believe and accept the idea that, in fact, everyone can identify everyone's voice. That, in fact, there's not something strange about his voice, but there's something strange about his brain. Specifically, as a condition called phonoagnosia. The colloquial term for this is voice blindness. So as one NPR reporter put it, someone with phonoagnosia can tell if you're male, female, old or young, happy, upset, sarcastic. They just have absolutely no idea who you are. And I think Steve Royster in some ways is this interesting emblem of the 21st century, because the position that he's in when he picks up the phone is exactly the position that we're all in on the internet. That if you get an email from a friend of yours and he's gushing about these really exciting Russian pharmaceutical discounts, your reaction is not to run out and buy them, but to tell him to change his password. And this for me is an extremely big deal for two reasons. One is that for all of his prescience, Alan Turing, I don't think, could have foreseen that by the year 2012, not only is the Turing test ever more closely contested every year at the Loebner Prize, but every interaction that we have is a kind of Turing test. Every single time you get an email, every single time you get a text message, you become the judge in a Turing test. You have to decide if this is really a person talking to you, or if it's a computer program claiming to be a person. So we're basically involved in the Turing test 24 hours a day, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not. The second thing that comes out of that is that no one would argue that a spam bot can reliably approximate the kinds of emails that you would get from a trusted friend. We're nowhere near at the point where there's that indistinguishability that Turing talks about. But we are at a point where computer programs can approximate bad emails. And so as a result, we try not to send them. And so I've found, for example, that just that slight pressure to avoid someone's spam filter has made me more articulate and polite when I talk to people. If I find a link that I want to send someone, 10 years ago, it might have been sufficient to just paste that link into the body of an email and have no subject and just send it. Nowadays, I imagine that the person I'm sending the link to isn't going to trust it enough to click the link. And so I basically have to perform my identity for them in order to trust them. I have to say Brian things to them and act Brianly before they'll trust me enough to click that link. And it's that pressure that I think can be this, frankly, profound force for sort of raising the bar on the way that we communicate. Online, we're constantly being asked to verify our identity, not only by people, but also by websites. And websites are increasingly asking us to prove that we are not bots. They do this in what I think is an extremely ill-advised fashion. And to illustrate that, I'd like to talk about one of the most famous recent examples of identity theft. In 2008, with the presidential race in full swing, this person, David Cornell, manages to persuade Yahoo that he is this person, Sarah Palin. And he's able to access all of her email records. And he does this because when you go to Yahoo Mail, you're asked to type in a password. Now, of course, Cornell didn't know it, and he didn't particularly feel like trying to brute force hack it. Instead, he did what Sarah Palin would do if she forgot her password, which is to click the link that says, "I forgot my password." And when you do that, Yahoo attempts to, as they say, verify your identity by asking you a series of questions. And these questions are things like, what's your birthday? What zip code do you live in? Where did you meet your spouse? Cornell found the information, the answers to these questions on Wikipedia in like 15 minutes, changed her password to popcorn, took a cold shower, and was subsequently charged with 20 years' worth of felonies. My reaction is not shame on David Cornell. It's shame on Yahoo. And I think the deeper point is that the types of things that users are being asked to provide are simply not the right things. To illustrate another example of where conveying your identity goes horribly wrong, I want to turn to a sort of even more infamous case than the Palin email hack, which is speed dating. Now, in some ways, a speed date is a lot like a Turing test. You're thrown in with this totally random stranger. You have 5 minutes to impress on them something of your unique, distinct, vibrant identity. And you're really hoping they don't see you as just this completely anonymous person. And you're having to do this under strict time constraints. There's a problem that a number of speed daters fall into. And in fact, it's so widely known that it's been parodied on Sex and the City, of all things. There's an episode of Sex and the City where Miranda Hobbs goes speed dating. And she meets a guy named Dwight Owens. And I'm going to read to you how Dwight Owens presents himself to Miranda Hobbs on their date. Hi, I'm Miranda Hobbs. Dwight Owens, private wealth group at Morgan Stanley, investment management for high net worth individuals and a couple pension plans. Like my job, been there 5 years, divorced, no kids, not religious. I live in New Jersey, speak French and Portuguese, Wharton Business School. Any of this appealing to you? And I think Dwight Owens, in many ways, is making the same mistake that Yahoo's making, which is that we're not defined by our properties. What we like about the people that we like, and what we love about the people that we love, are not their properties. It's their manner. And this turns out to be a completely different thing. In fact, the inventor of speed dating, I don't know if you knew that speed dating had an inventor, or that he is a Beverly Hills rabbi named Yaakov Deo. Yaakov Deo went so far in his organizing of these speed dating events as to attempt to make the Dwight Owens approach literally impossible. So he starts off by banning anyone talking about where they work or what they do for a living, because that's what everyone starts off with. And so everyone falls back on talking about their hometown and where they're from. So he bans talking about your hometown and where you're from. And what he's trying to do is force people into this mode where they're conveying who they are not by issues of content, but issues of form. And so this is the binary that I'm sort of setting up here. This idea that, on the one hand, we have authenticating by content. And that's what you typically see in the world of machines. What's your PIN? What's your social security number? Your password? What's your occupation? What's your birthplace? On the other hand are things that I'm calling form. So, for example, a signature, which is in the pre-computer world, the main way that people authenticated themselves in an anonymous environment. You can think of a signature as the exact opposite of a password. The word is known, but your manner of writing the word is what's essential. In the real world, we identify people by their gait, not the fact that they're walking, but the way that they walk. By their prosody, their timbre, the way that they laugh. These are the things that Steve Royster couldn't pin down. We also identify people by their diction and their syntax. And this becomes really crucial if you're in a Turing test, because that's all you have, are the words that you choose and the order that you put them in. I think it becomes a lot trickier to maintain individuality through diction and syntax in the modern world, because of something that has really become sort of the bane of my existence, and it's called autocomplete. So here's an example of what autocomplete can do. So this person sends a text message, "Your mom and I are going to divorce next month." What? Why? Call me, please. I wrote Disney, and the phone changed it. We are going to Disney. I don't know how many of you guys in the audience have smartphones, but I think we can all relate to an experience like this. I think this is the other wrinkle that I don't imagine that Alan Turing would have foreseen, which is that not only in the case of spam or in the case of hackers, do we have AI on the other end of the line, but now we have AI at our end of the line. That these algorithms are being used before the message even gets sent. And I think it's profoundly dangerous. This is an example of an actual screenshot from me typing a message. Someone asked me a few months ago, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm still feeling slightly ill." And my phone starts to change it to "I'll." And my reaction is what I think is pretty typical of phone users, which is that I just give up, that I just delete the word and I write "sick," because I'm just tired of fighting. That any of these technologies, if you have an older generation of phone, you're probably used to something called T9, which tries to translate from the numerical keypad to words, which does the same exact thing. If you try to use a slightly offbeat word or a slightly strange word, you are literally cajoled into speaking in a normal fashion. And for me as a poet, not only as a Turing test competitor, but as a poet, I think that in many ways autocomplete is the enemy of English literature. That part of what every writer strives to do is to sound not like everyone else, to use words in an idiosyncratic, fresh way. But the very statistical foundation on which all of this software is based is by creating efficiency through uniformity. If everyone gives up on the word ill, and we just say sick, and we just say ill, nobody's going to have any problems. I think that's an extremely dangerous trade-off. And I think that in some ways it's a threat not only to our humanity in these sort of Turing test sense, but it's also a threat to online security. That in fact the only aspect of hacking Sarah Palin's email that was tricky for David Cornell was how to phrase where she met her husband. So he tried Wazilla, it didn't work. Wazilla HS, didn't work. Wazilla High School, didn't work. High School, didn't work. Wazilla High, and he was in. That was the only barrier, was Sarah Palin's idiosyncratic diction. And so if this is something that's being threatened, then I think that's a danger, not only to our ability to be expressive, but also our ability to protect ourselves online. The way that we saw Walt Whitman championing this idea of a collective consciousness, there have been a lot of champions of uniform speech. Some of them come from the Bible. So this is Ignatius of Antioch in a letter to the Ephesians, and he's quoting the Corinthians. And he says, "May all speak the same thing concerning the same thing. Do ye, man by man, become but one choir." And the Bible also gives us this, the story of the Tower of Babel, right? That humans built this thing and God didn't like it, and so he punished them by creating differences in speech so that they would all talk slightly differently and they would never fully understand each other. There would always be this gap and this friction. Again, I think that computation sort of flips the equation, that I'm not really excited about the idea of all speaking the same thing concerning the same thing. I don't know that I want to live in that world. That doesn't sound particularly good to me. And I'll end with this picture of Antarctic penguins, because in some ways I see them as being the mascots of linguistic diversity. It sounds strange. So you may notice from this picture that all the penguins look almost exactly the same. And it turns out that that's actually the way that they look to other penguins. And the families arrive at this nesting site separately. And there may be as many as 150,000 different penguin families all converging. And they're all trying to find each other. But they all look the same. And so what penguins do is they make calls with their voice. And everyone's voice sounds slightly different. And that's the way that the families are able to assemble. And I think there's something in that for us. There's a certain parable there for the way that we use language and the way that we behave online. Because the opposite of identity isn't impersonation. It's not identity theft. It's anonymity. And if the only way out of anonymity is by verbal differences and unique verbal style, then bless Babel. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions from you guys. Yeah. The question is, why don't programs allow you to turn off autocomplete? I'm very happy to report, actually, a minor victory in this, which is that recently, a year or so ago, an online petition was being circulated on the internet and collected something like 20,000 signatures to petition Apple to create a setting in the settings drop-down where you could turn autocomplete off. And in one of the rare examples of Steve Jobs yielding to this sort of thing, he did. And so since that point, since sometime in 2010, you can turn it off on the phone. However, they also made it the default on all new versions of the operating system. So you may find yourself being auto-completed even when you're using a full keyboard, which I think is completely absurd. Yeah. The question is artistic creativity a distinguishing factor between man and machine? This is one of these ancient questions. By ancient, I guess I mean goes back to the 1950s. In that Turing anticipated that question when he wrote his original paper outlining the Turing test. And he said, what about this idea that computers aren't capable of originality? They're only capable of doing what they're told. And Turing takes a sort of low blow and says, well, I'm not convinced that humans are capable of originality. And I'm not convinced that we don't simply, in some slightly more complicated sense, repeat the behavior that we see or do what we're told. And, you can make that argument. I do think that creativity presents, in some ways, one of the ways that we can sort of hold on to the Aristotelian framework, if we want, that even if our sensitive soul is not unique because animals have that, and even if our rational soul isn't unique because computers have some version of that, art is one of those things that situates itself at the nexus of those two things. That we're using tools and using technology and thinking very deliberately about how to create these sensory impressions and convey some sort of feeling to another person. So you can make the argument that even if humans don't have any of these three different souls uniquely, the fact that we have all three of them enables us to do these sorts of things. And I would argue, a related question that I sometimes get is, what are the quintessential human emotions? And I would put them sort of in that same space between the sensitive soul and the rational soul. And so I would cite things like curiosity, wonder, and awe as the kinds of emotions that happen when the sensitive soul butts up against the rational soul. You look out at the stars and you know enough to comprehend how incomprehensible it is. And then you have this feeling of wonder, that it's the desire to know. The mathematician Steve Strogatz has this great quote that he says, "I'm really grateful to have been born a human because we're just smart enough to find math interesting." If we were any less smart, we wouldn't get it. And if we were any more smart, it would just be obvious. That we're really in the perfect place to just savor it. I want to make sure that I'm sort of understanding your question correctly. Are you sort of driving at this idea that our sort of educational system and our job training is sort of geared towards emphasizing math and science, which are these more sort of Right. Yeah. Um, I mean, one of the big paradigm shifts in AI happened at a point when people were sort of going from the idea that you could use computers to mimic the mind, the conscious experience that you have when you think about something. If you're doing long division, you have this series of steps. Okay, and now I do this. I carry the one, and they turn each of those things into a line of code, and now the computer can do it. And at a certain point, we hit this wall, which is that when my sister walks into the room and I recognize that it's her, what are the conscious steps that my mind proceeds through in order to make that judgment? Well, I have no idea, and it seems like that's just the wrong way to think about it. And so then you see these things, the development of neural networks, for example. The idea that instead of trying to simulate the mind, let's try to simulate the brain, the sort of underlying structure. And that's enabled a sort of a new set of problems to be tackled. The other thing that I think is really interesting is this idea that, in some sense, we're kind of co-evolving with the computer at this point. We've effectively become symbiotes. In the 1990s, I knew people's telephone numbers, and now I don't. Which I think, on the one hand, it's easy to lament that, we're using technology as a crutch and so forth. But for me, there's a deeper question. After the Watson victory on Jeopardy, the most interesting thing that I heard in response to that was from one of the deans of NYU Med School. He said, we're working with IBM on a version of Watson that instead of memorizing, the encyclopedias, it's going to memorize medical literature. And it's going to be able to know things like how to diagnose people, what drugs interact, so forth. And as the dean of a medical school, he says, this is pretty much going to put us back to the starting blocks in some ways, because so much of what we think that a medical education should be is implanting facts into the mind of the doctor. Well, when that no longer becomes important, we have to decide what a medical education should look like. So for me, I think there's this really compelling call to arms for educators to think about, to what extent is it really important that students remember their trigonometric identities? To what extent do we say, we only have a finite number of hours to educate every citizen? Give them a graphing calculator and let's spend that hour talking about something else. I think that's a really profound question, and it speaks to this idea that we're effectively just becoming this co-evolved species, that we're deciding what skills we think are important for humans to have based on the sort of context of what's out there. I think we absolutely are. Yeah, absolutely. I read the autobiography of Feng-Xiang Su, who is the IBM engineer that developed Deep Blue. And he's very adamant about this point, that a machine did not defeat Garry Kasparov, the world champion of chess. I defeated Garry Kasparov, the world champion of chess. And I think that speaks to that idea that, in some ways, you can think of computers as disembodied policy. That all of the objects that we interact with are these sort of residues of human activity. That there's sort of ghosts everywhere, right? Like someone built those stairs and chopped that wood and cut it and put it there. And we don't see them, but they're there sort of implicitly in the fact that the stairs are there. And computers are sort of the mental version of that. someone decided that this was the appropriate kind of conceptual framework with which to, handle email, say, and that's the way that email gets handled. Someone actually had that thought, and we're all sort of traveling the same pathways. And so you get these strange things in which, on the one hand, you can think of the computer as just sort of the residue of the person. But you can also imagine a person, when a person's operating purely by policy, it's not really them, it's somebody else. So when you talk to someone in customer service, that's an interesting example if you think about it in the lens of the Turing test, where you really are interacting with a real person, but that person is taking what you say, typing it into a computer, and then reading back to you what comes up on their screen. So it's effectively artificial intelligence software running on a human brain. And so I think it can cut both ways. Siri, gosh. I think that Apple has their work cut out for them. The question is, what do I think about Siri, the iPhone voice recognition? The voice recognition software on the iPhone is called Siri. You can ask it, driving directions. You can say, do I need an umbrella today? And it'll tell you whether you do or not. I think one of the big challenges that Apple's facing with Siri is that they decided to give it a personality. And when you do that, you run into these cleverbot type problems. So if you ask Siri, I need to hide a body, Siri will say, well, here's a lumber mill, here's a dump site, here's the woods, it's over here. That they've put in all these interesting little jokes. If you ask it, what's the best phone, it has some witty response to that. If you say, Siri, I'm drunk, it calls you a cab. There are all these sort of clever things that they put into it. But I think it's tricky because, as Cleverbot shows, the range of things that Siri can be expected to respond to is effectively infinite. And so if you have one guy who's sort of the auteur, the architect of Siri, there's no way he can preload it with enough responses. And so what you have to do, if you want to give it the range of behavior that users expect, is that you need to basically crowdsource it. You need this massive team, or you need to somehow do what Cleverbot does, which is kind of scrape the user's language and sort of reflect it back to them. But as soon as you start doing it, then the program starts to lose its identity, right? It starts to become this pastiche of all these different people. So I get the sense that Apple hasn't totally resolved how they want to answer that. I think that's a pretty fundamental challenge with the architecture of how chatbots work. The question is, how did I do at the Turing test? And to preserve dramatic suspense and also take this opportunity to plug my book, I'll say that you can read all about it in The Most Human Human. Thanks.